There is a moment in every empire's life cycle when the signs are no longer subtle, yet people still fail to see them. And the pattern no empire survives begins quietly, long before anyone calls it collapse. In this opening frame, we step into that silence, into the calm hum before the systemic pressure breaks its composure. What if the same mechanism is unfolding again right now, beneath the noise of daily headlines? What if the instability we sense isn't about markets at all, but about a repeating psychological script? From above, in that distant, almost documentary stillness, the global economy resembles a breathing organism, expanding, contracting, expanding again. But within that rhythm hides a structural fault. Debt grows faster than the system's ability to sustain it, and with each cycle, the gap between hope and mathematics widens. This is where financial psychology becomes inseparable from reality, where denial becomes a collective habit rather than a personal flaw. Across generations, we've been taught to interpret expansion as progress, even when the indicators quietly shift from healthy growth to systemic strain. And as the cycle stretches, the early tremors appear in the form of distorted incentives. Mispriced risk and a subtle erosion of trust, signals that echo across market cycles and historical collapses alike. The uncomfortable question is simple. If this pattern is repeated across ancient empires, early industrial economies, and every major financial regime, what makes us believe we are exempt? What if the end of era sensation people feel isn't irrational anxiety, but an intuitive recognition of a sequence humanity has lived through before? Every collapsing empire tells itself a similar story, that its institutions are too sophisticated, its systems too resilient, its people too informed to fail the way others did. Yet decline rarely begins with spectacle. It begins with small psychological adjustments. The normalization of debt, the assumption that tomorrow will resemble today, the belief that cycles are problems for other nations, other eras. As we enter this narrative, remember one idea: the mechanisms driving today's pressures are not new. The behaviors surrounding them are not new. And the consequences, if left unquestioned, will not be new. History doesn't repeat, but its debt signatures do. When we look back at past eras of prosperity turning into decline, a quiet but consistent pattern emerges. Empires rarely collapse because of a single catastrophic event. They unravel slowly through cumulative pressure built on assumptions that feel safe, until they aren't. And as we examine these moments, the parallels with today's global economy become difficult to ignore. Consider 1929, the moment often simplified into a story about a stock market crash. But beneath the dramatic headlines was something far more structural: a long cycle of expanding credit, rising leverage, and a cultural belief that growth could be sustained indefinitely. This was not just an economic phenomenon, it was a psychological one. The belief that the system could not break created the precise behaviors that made it fragile. The very optimism meant to support the economy became the mechanism of its vulnerability. In retrospect, historians note how financial history shows this clearly. Excess debt distorts perception first, markets second. Then fast forward to 2008, another period defined by misplaced certainty. The cycle leading to the financial crisis echoed the same deeper dynamics: widespread denial, institutional overconfidence, and a collective misreading of risk. For years, the system absorbed growing imbalances, convincing people that innovation could outpace gravity. But when the correction finally arrived, it wasn't the subprime loans alone that broke the system. It was the psychology around them. Wealth transfer didn't happen in a single moment. It unfolded as the weakest hands were forced to liquidate and the strongest quietly accumulated assets at discounted valuations. Even further back, ancient empires like Rome faced eerily similar mechanisms. Expanding territory required expanding debt. Debasement of currency, the ancient equivalent of modern monetary distortion, triggered public anxiety, denial, and a cultural shift toward short-term thinking. The cycle was never framed as collapse while it was happening. It was simply called changing circumstances, the same language we hear in today's money patterns and institutional narratives. Across all these moments, one thread persists. People misinterpret early signals because they assume their era is uniquely protected. Yet the evidence says otherwise. The combination of rising leverage, declining trust, and psychological normalization of imbalance has always marked the final chapters of major financial regimes. If history is a guide, today's pressures are not anomalies. They are echoes. If the past offers the rhyme, the mechanism provides the structure. Every financial regime, ancient, industrial, modern, follows a progression that seems almost biological. A system expands through debt, stabilizes through confidence, then destabilizes through the very behaviors it once rewarded. The question is not whether the cycle exists, but why it keeps repeating long after societies claim to understand it. At the core lies a deceptively simple equation. Debt expands faster than productive capacity. But mathematically predictable pressure transforms into systemic fragility only when psychology overlays the numbers. This is where investing behavior becomes more influential than policy, and where behavioral finance explains the collapse better than any spreadsheet. The cycle always begins the same way. Credit is introduced as a tool for growth, but quickly evolves into a cultural expectation. As access to borrowing expands, denial becomes part of the economic fabric. People assume rising debt is temporary, manageable, or ultimately irrelevant as long as the system remains stable. Overconfidence grows. Institutions stretch balance sheets. Households normalize risk they once feared. The investor mindset shifts from caution to entitlement, not because people become reckless, but because the environment rewards complacency. Then comes the distortion phase. Cycle pressure accumulates quietly as leverage spreads through the system. Debt rolls forward faster than incomes, revenues, or productivity can catch it. Yet, instead of addressing the imbalance, the collective response is psychological reframing. This is fine, because it worked last time. This is normal now. This is how modern economies function. This moment, when math and emotion diverge, is where fragility forms. Liquidity thins in certain sectors. Risk becomes mispriced. Institutions start relying on future conditions to justify present decisions. The system becomes acutely sensitive to small shocks. And the cascade begins not with a dramatic event but with a subtle shift. Lenders tighten standards, or buyers step back, or confidence cracks just enough for capital to move defensively. Then, almost imperceptibly, the correction emerges. It appears external, unexpected, or unfair, but it has always been internal, structural, and inevitable. The mechanism is the same across centuries. Cycle pressure gives behavior distortion, gives systemic fragility, gives correction. This is why every major collapse feels both sudden and strangely familiar. It is not the event that triggers the downfall. It is the long psychological buildup that preceded it. When people, institutions, and empires believe they are uniquely insulated from consequences, the cycle accelerates. The quiet truth is that systems break from within, not from outside. If the historical echoes feel familiar, today's environment amplifies them with unprecedented scale and speed. The structure of the global economy has evolved, but the underlying psychological patterns remain almost unchanged. What we are witnessing now is not a random moment of instability. It is a modern iteration of an old mechanism, accelerated by technology, obscured by financial engineering, and normalized by daily noise. In the age of AI-driven productivity forecasts and algorithmic trading, the surface narrative appears forward-looking and innovative. But beneath that optimism lies a growing tension, an economic system increasingly reliant on debt expansion rather than organic growth. The numbers themselves are abstract, but the behavior they incentivize is not. People spend more because money feels detached from value. Institutions borrow more because the cost of capital seems artificially calm. And governments accumulate obligations under the assumption that stability can be engineered indefinitely. These dynamics form the backbone of the quiet instability accumulating toward what some analysts label the market crash. 2026 scenario, not as a prediction, but as a stress point in a recurring cycle. When we examine liquidity flows, debt rollover timelines, and global monetary policy, small fractures become visible. These fractures are not dramatic enough to dominate headlines, but they matter. They reflect the gradual tightening of a system where leverage compounds faster than the system's ability to rebalance. And in this environment, the global economy behaves less like a coordinated structure and more like a network of interdependent vulnerabilities. Corporate debt levels push against historical ceilings. Sovereign debt relies increasingly on rollover rather than repayment. Shadow banking expands in the margins, absorbing risks that traditional institutions avoid, quietly, invisibly, and without the public scrutiny that marked previous financial crises. Media consumption intensifies the distortion. Algorithms feed viewers narratives that confirm their existing assumptions, reducing the psychological sensitivity required to perceive early signals. The result is a population more informed than ever, yet paradoxically more disconnected from systemic reality. When information is endless, attention becomes scarce. And when attention is scarce, early warning signs go unnoticed. Meanwhile, the architecture of modern expansion leans heavily on expectations that future earnings will justify current valuations, that technological growth will offset structural debt issues, that a soft landing is not just possible but probable. Yet the underlying math hasn't changed. The system still relies on continual expansion to sustain itself, even as measurable productivity growth slows and demographic pressures rise. This is the environment in which the concept of an economic reset emerges, not as a dramatic event, but as a natural endpoint of a system that has stretched its assumptions too far for too long. When the correction comes, it tends to appear rational only in hindsight. The signs are already here. They're just quiet. If the system cracks from within, it's because people do. The most consistent force across every financial era isn't technology, policy, or innovation, it's human psychology repeating itself with remarkable precision. And the unsettling part is this: the patterns aren't driven by malice or incompetence. They're driven by cognitive biases baked deeply into the way humans interpret stability, risk, and change. At the center lies a paradox. People seek certainty, yet the financial world thrives on uncertainty. This tension leads to predictable distortions in perception, distortions that shape the exact behaviors accelerating systemic fragility. Financial psychology helps us understand why the same misjudgments appear across centuries, not because people fail to learn, but because the emotional cost of awareness feels higher than the comfort of familiarity. The first and most defining bias is denial. When debt grows quietly and gradually, when prices rise slowly, when institutions assure stability, denial becomes a coping mechanism. It's easier to believe the system is self-correcting than to accept that its foundation is structurally stressed. This bias is not a flaw. It's a survival instinct. But in economic environments, it turns small imbalances into large ones. Next comes overconfidence, the belief that past cycles were aberrations, that modern tools are superior, that humanity has outgrown the constraints of mathematics. This overconfidence permeates everything from household budgeting to institutional risk models. It shapes the wealth mindset in ways that feel empowering but often lead to fragile financial decisions. Then there is the herd instinct, arguably the most powerful driver of systemic momentum. People don't just observe each other. They mirror each other. In rising markets, fear of missing out overrides caution. In declining markets, fear of loss overrides strategy. This synchronized emotional response magnifies volatility, not because individuals choose irrationality, but because humans are social organisms wired for collective behavior. Finally, the normalcy bias reinforces the illusion that stability is permanent. When daily life feels predictable, people assume the financial system shares the same resilience. This is why quiet periods of expansion often precede major corrections. The less dramatic the environment feels, the more dramatically people misread risk. These cognitive patterns shape not just personal decisions but entire financial eras. They influence borrowing habits, investment strategies, political narratives, and cultural expectations. And they ensure that the mechanisms of collapse remain psychologically invisible until they are mathematically undeniable. This is why the idea of quiet investing matters in a systemic sense. Not as a strategy, not as advice, but as an awareness. A way of recognizing that market behavior is fundamentally human behavior. And humans, regardless of era, tend to repeat the same emotional scripts. In the end, markets don't change because systems evolve. They change because people don't. When we step back from the noise, a quieter truth emerges. One that doesn't demand fear, urgency, or alarm, but a clearer understanding of how cycles behave and why they persist. Every empire that expanded through debt eventually reached a threshold where mathematics exceeded optimism, where psychology shaped outcomes more than policy, and where confidence became the final resource holding the system together. Today is no different. What feels like a modern exception is, in reality, a familiar sequence unfolding with a contemporary veneer. The patterns we've traced, the historical echoes, the systemic mechanics, the modern fractures, the cognitive biases form a coherent narrative. Not a catastrophic one, but a revealing one. It shows that the forces shaping the present are neither random nor unprecedented. They're cumulative expressions of human behavior interacting with structural limits. And as these pressures converge, what many interpret as uncertainty is simply the next phase of a long recurring rhythm. Within this rhythm lies the quiet phenomenon often misunderstood: wealth transfer. Not as conspiracy, not as engineered design, but as a natural outcome of cycles correcting imbalances. When systems reset, value doesn't disappear, it moves. And historically, it moves toward those who understand the psychological dynamics earlier than the crowd. This is why awareness matters. Not as a strategy for gain, but as a lens to interpret the signals modern society is conditioned to overlook. The coming years may bring structural adjustments that feel abrupt, whether through currency shifts, institutional realignments, or the broader economic reset hinted at in academic and financial circles. But the real story behind these shifts is not collapse, it is transition. And transitions have always been integral to economic evolution. The danger is not the correction itself. It is approaching it with the same biases that magnified the imbalances in the first place. Calm awareness creates a different posture. It disengages from panic narratives and equally from blind optimism. It recognizes that understanding cyclical patterns is not about predicting the future, but about removing the emotional distortion that makes systems so fragile. And it accepts that change, even uncomfortable change, is part of the natural arc of every financial regime. Empires have risen and fallen under the weight of their own assumptions. The global system will evolve the same way, not through sudden collapse, but through a reconfiguration shaped by psychology, incentives, and time. In that sense, awareness is not fear. Awareness is continuity.